Families of the victims from Flight 5342 continue to speak out against a section of the new National Defense Bill that they say would undo changes made to make flying safer. Last week, the House passed the Defense Authorization Act, but lawmakers in the chair of the NTSB pushing back, saying a provision in that could allow military helicopters to fly in at D.C. airspace without flight tracking data turned on. That technology known as ADS-B, and it shares an aircraft's location with other aircraft. It was turned off when that military helicopter collided with Flight 5342. At a news conference today, family members say that provision needs to be stripped from the bill and replaced with the Rotor Act, which would require aircraft to have technology and close any loopholes for military helicopters to turn it off.
We're demanding that the system do better. No family should ever have to stand where we're standing today. We expect better, and people deserve better. Safety must come first. We ask for thoughtful, evidence-based improvements that honor the memory of those we lost and protect every family that flies.
The Senate is expected to take up the defense bill this week. Senator Ted Cruz, who is chair for the Transportation Committee, believes there is unanimous support to replace that section of the bill. Cruz added that provision did not go through the normal clearing process to get into the defense bill and believes few House members knew it was in there before it was passed.